So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Dr. Amie Cohen. I am the Assistant Director for Course Assessment and Evaluation in the Center for Excellence in Learning and Teaching. And today's session is going to cover all things rubrics. So rubrics are an important tool in assessment, particularly because the majority of our assessment methods, especially for more advanced learning outcomes, are subjective, right? We have students writing papers, presenting content, maybe creating a project of some kind, working in groups. And so there isn't necessarily a clear right or wrong answer that there might be with, assessments such as like multiple choice exam questions. So in order to make assessment a little bit more straightforward, a little bit more standardized, rubrics are an important tool um, for both students and instructors. So today, we are going to be going over just kind of the basics of rubrics as a tool. We'll be talking about steps to creating and using a rubric in your courses. We'll also be talking a little bit of AI. So AI can help you be more efficient in creating your rubrics and giving you kind of a foundation and a place to start. I will definitely tell you, you don't want to just ask AI for a rubric and take it as it is and use that exactly verbatim. But it can certainly be helpful in starting the process. We'll talk a little bit about rubric norming and calibration. This is important for when more than one person is going to be using the rubric to evaluate work, right? So whether you have teaching assistants or multiple graders in a course, or you're looking to create a rubric that's going to be used across multiple sections with different instructors for a course, ideally you want to make sure that it's being interpreted and applied kind of in a consistent and fair way. And then we'll talk a little bit about rubrics in Brightspace and how you can use them as a tool to make it easier to provide student feedback through the LMS. So it is an assessment-based presentation. It wouldn't be one without learning objectives. So some of the main takeaways for today will be the ability to distinguish between a holistic and an analytical rubric and really make that decision for your assignments or your assessment tasks, which ones are most appropriate to use. We'll talk about developing, utilizing, and revising rubrics for your course assignments. The ability to kind of articulate how a norming process or a rubric norming session would proceed. And then also we'll go over the skills for building a rubric in Brightspace. So at its foundation, right, on the most basic level is rubrics are essentially a tool to assess student learning. And rubrics can be used at multiple different levels, could be used in a course, which is what we're talking about today, but can also be used at a program level, right? So in terms of capstones and, kind of upon completion of a program, you could use it to evaluate, a capstone type project to evaluate learning at the program level. But primarily at the course level, right, rubrics are used to set assignment expectations and to, help with as a grading tool. And it also makes it clear to students' expectations by describing what the different level of performance looks like on an assignment or on a project, a paper, presentation, with having kind of detailed, objective, measurable descriptions of what is considered exemplary work, what is satisfactory work, and kind of going from there. So rubrics are used, both for grading, right, to, assign a letter grade or assign a numeric grade to a student assignment, but also simply to assess learning, right, for you to get, kind of that judgment point at any point in the semester to say, are students getting what I want them to get out of this class? And it can be used, as information to potentially pivot your lesson plans, maybe review some concepts if it seems like students are still struggling in one way or the other. There are two types of rubrics that we're going to be talking about today, and I'll share a little bit more detail about each, some examples as well. But there's the holistic rubric, where it's really just one big picture description of the different levels of performance, whereas analytical rubrics will break down grading into different components and have a list of different criteria that each get their own rating. And when you see some of those examples, you'll get a sense of the difference. So why are rubrics useful? Why should we use rubrics? Essentially, there's a lot of benefits for both students and for instructors. So for students, it provides that structure, that clear expectation. A lot of students, sometimes will get an assignment and have a lot of questions in terms of what is the expected length? How many sources am I supposed to have? How many sections? What content is necessary? If you have a rubric, that information is clearly laid out and able for a student to see and review. And ideally, it's meant for students to be able to use as a guide while they compose their own work, right? While they go through and draft their assignments, potentially make revisions, make changes. Ideally, students will be using it to self-evaluate as they go along and strive to improve and get to that, top rated level of performance or category. So if they have it up front when given an assignment, they can use it kind of as a measuring stick along the way. And it also, when students get their work back and see how they were assessed on the rubric, it easily is able for them to identify what it is they still need to work on, right? What section of a given assignment or a given paper, right? Maybe their organization and their attention to detail was great, but their creativity or originality needed a little bit of work. And so the rubric kind of provides that built-in feedback for students. So for instructors, it makes the grading process itself quicker and more transparent. So if you think about it, when you create the rubric, more of the work is done up front, right? You create the rubric, you know what each level of performance is supposed to look like, and then you just kind of go through and use it as a measuring stick for each student work. So once you have the work done up front, again, it's a far more efficient. It also allows you to be fair across all submissions. So whether there are multiple individuals grading or whether, you're grading all of your papers or projects in more than one sitting, I think sometimes we've all experienced when grading, one day we sit down and we seem to be, I don't know whether in a better mood or we've just, had, a number of positive student papers that we've read. So we're, maybe being a little bit more generous in our judgments. And then other days, maybe a little bit grumpier. So one, paper where you're like, but we just talked about in that class yesterday. How did you not address this piece? So sometimes even just when we sit down at different times, our grading can be a little inconsistent based on our mood or our experiences in that given day. But again, if you have a rubric, it helps control for that a little bit more than if you don't. And again, rubric has that built-in feedback, so you don't necessarily need to write out as detailed information for every student in order to give them opportunities to improve. So our rubric types, right, are your holistic rubrics and your analytical rubrics. Holistic, right, there's one overall judgment of a student's work. So there'll be a description of what the assignment or task was, a performance scale, right? So sometimes you could lay it out specifically saying like, this is what an A looks like, this is what a B looks like, this is what a C looks like. You could also have the performance scale be, exemplary, satisfactory, and developing, right? You would choose what that scale would be. And then you would describe what that exemplary piece of work looks like or what that A-level piece of work would look like. And so you only have to make one overall decision in rating the quality of work. An analytical rubric, I think, is what people tend to envision or think about when you consider rubrics, and that's when you're really having multiple dimensions or criteria that you're assessing, right? So say it's a research paper, you might have a section where you're evaluating the quality of the thesis, right? How well was it formulated? How many points would you give for the thesis? Then how many points more for just the writing mechanics and the organization of the paper, or the way in which the student verbally presented their research if they needed to present as well. So the analytical rubric has that description of the task, has the scale of performance levels, but then you select a performance level across multiple different criteria for the assignment. And therefore, there's going to be more descriptions that you have to write because you need to represent what is an exemplary thesis, what is a satisfactory thesis, what is a thesis that needs improvement, right? And then likewise, what is exemplary writing mechanics? What is satisfactory writing mechanics, and so on. Excuse me. So your holistic rubric example here is one that is based on critical thinking. And you see the performance scale in this case is just 1 through 4. So it's simply numeric. There's no verbal description of these different levels. But you could see a student that would earn a 4 out of 4 in terms of critical thinking would consistently do all or most of the following, right? So it talks about interpreting evidence, identifying arguments, analyzing alternative points of view, drawing conclusions, justifying results, and following the evidence, right? So you kind of see where it's one big picture, and maybe it's like, well, what do I do if a student is accurately interpreting the evidence, but maybe not always following where it leads, right? So that's where it can become a little bit more difficult with a holistic rubric because you have to make that decision. Okay, well, which category does it fit best, where the student does all or most of the following, because it is a holistic, one big picture judgment. For the analytical rubric, right, you're looking at multiple different dimensions. So you have, knowledge integration here, for example, the focus on the topic, right, on whether it's narrow enough or, there's a clear direction to, in this case, I believe it's a paper, a research paper for a health issues class. How in-depth is the discussion? Is the writing cohesive? How is the spelling and the grammar? And then, the number of resources, right, that were used and proper citation and APA, right? So you're selecting a performance level for each of these different criteria. A little bit more detailed, obviously even more work up front for crafting all of these descriptions. But sometimes it's very clear that, a student may have done really good in identifying sources and focusing on a topic, but maybe their paper wasn't extremely cohesive. So maybe they're expert in the first 2 criteria, but more proficient or apprentice in another. So it allows you to differentiate. And analytical rubrics, as a result, give students even more detailed feedback because they know on which criteria they really lost points or maybe need to improve. So holistic rubrics, one of the advantages, they're easier to construct, right? So you saw with the first one, there were just 4 performance levels that needed to be described. It can save time when grading because it's only one overall decision. And because it's kind of simpler, a little bit less detail, only one decision point, it can be easier to train others to use. The disadvantages, the feedback is less specific. It can be challenging to score in cases where, it's not very clear which, category is, consistently doing all or most, right? Maybe you really feel they're between 2. And since you only have one decision there, there's less leeway to kind of have that gray area. Analytical rubrics provides much more rich feedback. As I said before, students know exactly which criteria and which areas they need to improve and which ones they're excelling at. Um, you also have the advantage of putting more weight on certain criteria. So, we just looked at a research paper that had, APA formatting on there, and maybe that's important. You want to make sure students know how to format their work, but that's not necessarily the key learning objective for your paper. Maybe you really want to make sure they're able to, kind of critically appraise, summarize, and critique and evaluate research piece of research that they're reviewing. And so how good they are at those things and the content and the depth of discussion is a lot more important than how many points you want to give to proper citations. And so with analytical rubrics, you can weigh one criteria as more important than another. The disadvantages, obviously, there's more writing of descriptions involved, so it takes more time to create and a little bit more time to grade because you have to make a decision for each criteria as opposed to one overall holistic judgment. And therefore, if you are going to train others, it tends to be a little lengthier. The norming process in terms of making sure everyone is applying the rubric similarly can be a little bit more complex. I just saw a question in the chat that, is the analytical one better when there's multiple raters? I think that I would lean towards saying yes, although it might be a little bit more training and norming involved to make sure everyone's on the same page and using it. But holistic is definitely more subjective. So the more description and more detail you can put, the analytical ones tend to be superior there. So steps to kind of using and creating the rubric. The first thing is to review the assignment or task, right? What are you looking for students to demonstrate through the assignment, right? What learning objectives are you assessing? So I think, how central it is to a learning outcome for the course, how much it's worth in terms of the course. Sometimes holistic rubrics are good for smaller assignments that are not as big of a portion of a student's grade. So you always want to think about first what you're having students do and what the purpose is. If there's a single learning objective too, then holistic is a lot easier, right? If you're using a larger project to assess more than one learning objective, it usually makes sense to go more analytical, right? Because maybe the course, you want them to be able to locate and identify resources, but you also want them to be able to critique them, right? So you want separate criteria to assess each of those things on the rubric. So again, the decision, I think holistic tends to be good for assignments that are covering, really just one central learning objective and maybe are not worth as many points in terms of the student's overall grade. Analytical tend to be better fit when the project is a little bit larger scale. You're looking to assess multiple learning objectives through the student's work, and it tends to be a larger portion of their grade. So if you do make the decision to go with the analytical rubric, then you need to decide on what the criteria will be that you're evaluating. Ultimately, this should connect back with the student learning objectives for the assignments and for the course, right? So for this assignment, if there's 3 or 4 different learning objectives you're looking to assess, then you probably want to have, criteria connected to those 3 different learning objectives. So, perhaps if it's a, paper for a writing course, right? When it comes to effective writing, you want students to be able to organize their writing well, to develop their content out, to use evidence, to use proper grammar and mechanics, right? And if these are all, learning objectives for the course or for the unit, then you would want to have them be separate criteria. And once you have your criteria, you create a grid for your rubric. When you're creating the grid, it's important to think about your performance scale, right? How many performance levels do you want to have, right? Sometimes a 3-point scale is perfectly sufficient, right? Where you have, like a developing or needs improvement category, a satisfactory, and then an exemplary or exceeds expectations types of performance levels. Sometimes you may want to get a little bit more granular. You may want to have 4. I would say best practice is 3 or 4. If you go beyond that, it becomes really hard to differentiate between, okay, what's, level 1 versus level 2 versus level 3 compared to 4 and 5. It can be hard to differentiate beyond a 4-point scale. So I think best practice 3 or 4-point tends to be a good guideline. And then you would assign a score or a title to each level of performance. From an inclusive and a pedagogy perspective and a positive teaching perspective, you want to avoid negative language. So traditionally, before inclusive pedagogy became more of a thing, a lot of times you'd see terms on a rubric like poor, unacceptable, below average. You just don't want to assign those types of terminologies, those types of descriptors to student work. Instead, use terms like developing, beginning, novice is one you might see. Needs improvement, I think, is somewhere on the border of acceptable, or like maybe that's kind of negative language, because I think that over time has become a negative in our just kind of ethos of grading and education, but it's still better than something like poor or unacceptable. Also, as a general rule on a rubric, again, it's kind of a philosophy, but scores of 0 should generally be reserved for if there's no submission or that section of a paper or assignment was just not included or addressed. So you really don't need to have a score of 0 on your performance scale. 0 means that work was absent. So again, if it's a multi-part project and they're missing that part, you can't rate the work. It's just a 0 for that portion. But if it's holistic overall, right, 0 just means nothing was given. So you generally don't want to assign scores of 0 to any of your actual performance levels. So once you have performance levels, that's when it becomes time to write descriptions for each performance level or criteria. And that is where, we'll go in later to talk about how you can use AI to make your work more efficient. Particularly in the description writing, AI can kind of give you a foundation to start with. So it's just one thing to keep in mind, but you want to have really descriptions that are clear and as objective as possible. And we'll talk a little bit more about what makes a good description on a rubric shortly. But after writing those descriptions, then you should kind of review it yourself, maybe take it for a test drive with some student sample work, seek feedback from students, from colleagues, from the Center for Excellence in Learning and Teaching, right? I do take individual consultations, and I'm happy to, go over a rubric with you and make suggestions. If you do have multiple individuals using it, you can either, kind of have an informal conversation, maybe grade a sample work, or you can go through the official formal process of norming the rubric. Again, I would say it really depends on, the implications for what the rubric's being used for. So is it like a final assignment that's going to make a decision on whether a student passes a course or not? Or is it just a small percentage of a class, that type of thing? So sometimes it could be more of an informal discussion, or sometimes you can go through a formal norming process. And then it's always very important that when you share the assignment, the rubric should be given upfront. So again, in an ideal world, students are using it as a guide or a benchmark as they're drafting their work. So they can kind of use it as that measuring stick. They should have it before they start their work, not be given it upon receiving their grade and their feedback. And at that point, once students submit their work, that's when you can actually do the assessment, do the evaluation, do the grading, and rate students' work uh, against the performance levels that you described. And then after you use a rubric once or twice, you can make revisions. You'll find either from questions students have about feedback, maybe questions about why they got one rating over another, things of that nature. You can find pieces where you can make it a little more clear, a little bit more detailed. So for descriptions, I think it's important to know that there should be a description for each scale point or criteria for it to really be a true rubric. A lot of times I've seen grading tools that are, checklists or, give a description of what ideal work would be for you to get full 100% credit. But there's no description for, okay, well, what does 75% credit look like? What is, satisfactory? If it's not exemplary, what's kind of like borderline, or what's fair? What's, average? So you should really have a description for all scale points and all criteria. Whenever possible, you should make the description specific and observable, right? So if you can include numbers, if it's something like the number of sources that are being used, you could certainly put in numbers around how many references a student should have. If there is information or expectations around, like grammar and mechanics and, errors with that, you could put, exemplary is 0 errors and, maybe satisfactory is minimal, like 1 to 3 errors, things like that. You also want to have parallel language across scale points. Basically, this means the descriptions sound pretty similar, except maybe one thing, right? Maybe the number you used, maybe a descriptive word. But when a student kind of reads through the different levels of performance, something jumps out to them about what the difference is between satisfactory and exemplary. And then the same way, just overall, it's good to have those descriptions shared and get feedback from colleagues and students about whether there are areas that are still kind of gray and super subjective. Again, we can't get rid of all subjectivity because the whole point here is that we're creating a rubric to make a subjective process more objective. But you're never going to make something that's by nature subjective 100% objective. And then as you go through the revision process, that's where you'll kind of identify those gray areas and say, I don't know if this is really descriptive enough to make a judgment call. So here's an example of another rubric, and it's an analytical rubric. You can see also the learning objectives on this slide, and you can see how the criteria really align and line up with the learning objectives. So students being able to collaborate with peers. So you have a criteria scale for teamwork. Presenting an argument, you have a criteria for presentation of the argument. Applying research skills, there's use of research and data, and then engaging in educational discourse, that's response to the other debate team. So you can kind of see how the criteria are lining up with the learning objectives for the scientific debate assignments. And then you can see a little bit of that parallel language, right? Little or no evidence of collaboration, some evidence of collaboration, and then clear evidence of collaboration. And you see that kind of, I bolded some of the words here that are meant to differentiate exemplary from satisfactory. You also see the numbers, so use of 1 scholarly resource, use of 2 to 3 scholarly resources, uses of 3 or more scholarly resources. So this rubric was used for a project in a first-year seminar course. So obviously it's not like a super intense research project that needed multiple uh, sources of data, but you can see kind of what the developing through the exemplary looks like, and you can see that parallel language and kind of easily tell what the difference is between um, your developing levels, your satisfactory levels, and then your exemplary levels. Okay, so we went through a lot of what the appropriate steps are, and you still want to, kind of upfront consider your assignment, consider your learning objectives, and think about, what is the appropriate list of criteria that I want to assess? What is the appropriate um, performance scale I want to use, right? Do I want to use 3 or 4? Now, when you start using AI in rubric creation, maybe you're somewhere in between and you can use prompts to, tweak it as well. The good thing about a lot of generative AI platforms, particularly Copilot, which we have here at Stony Brook, is that when you do ask for a rubric, you can export it into Excel and then kind of make some easy edits based on your own expertise. So I'm just going to zoom out of here for 1 minute, and I'm going to go into um, Microsoft Copilot and just show one prompt that I went through. Um, and essentially, you would want to repurpose a prompt similar to this for what your course is, what your assignment is, and what you think your criteria would be, right? So with a prompt, it's good to tell the AI what they're doing, what they're teaching, what level, what the course is. You want to specify whether it's an analytical rubric or a holistic rubric that you're looking for, and what the assignment is. If you want to include more details, you can actually upload a description of the assignment. The good thing about Microsoft Copilot through Stony Brook is it is a protected version that we have through the university. So our data is not being used by Microsoft to improve the product, right? A lot of data privacy issues have come up over generative AI. So this is just something to think about. Now you'll see here, right, I specified that I wanted a 3-point scale. So again, you could make that decision up front. Do you think you want 3? Do you think you want 4 points? Sometimes you're not sure. You could ask AI, it'll generate something for you, and then you could ask it to change it, which is just fine. And then here I put a list of criteria for what I wanted to be assessed based on the sections of the proposal. And so here is what came out, right? I'm not going to say it's perfect. There definitely is a starting point for me to, build off of. But there may be places where I want to put a little bit more detail in. And you can either continue entering prompts to make changes, right? So I can say, can you modify the above rubric to be on a 4-point performance scale and see what it does for me. And now it's kind of breaking it down a little bit more. But again, you may want to, make that decision. Is there really a difference between, the 3rd category and the 4th category? You're also able, as I said before, to download it into Excel very easily so you can make your own changes as you would choose to. Now, sometimes you might have a more general prompt. So here's just an example that I put into ChatGPT before. And so in this case, I said I'm an instructor of an introductory college writing course, and I wanted a holistic rubric for a persuasive essay assignment. So I didn't ask for an analytical rubric, right, with criteria. And then I didn't specify any um, achievement scale. So it just gave me what it wanted to give me. So AI is always going to, um, kind of produce something based on what you put in. So if you put in, more of a vague or less detailed prompt, the quality is going to be a little unclear, different from what you're looking for. Now, in this case, I asked for a holistic rubric and it gave me an analytical rubric, right? So it gave me criteria in terms of thesis, organization, evidence, audience tone, etc. And so I prompted it again and said, this is an analytical rubric. Please create a holistic rubric. And then essentially the AI kind of apologized and said, I'm right. Um, and defined what a holistic rubric is and gave me one, right? So you can kind of see, what the difference here would be in terms of how much information you put in. AI is not perfect, right? Because the first time I asked for a holistic rubric, that's not what it gave me. Um, so I think it's important to make clear that AI is not replacing us. We still absolutely need our expertise. I'm just noticing a question in the chat. Will I be sharing the PowerPoint? Yes, I'll be sharing both the recording and the PowerPoint slides with all registrants and all attendees after the fact. So these are just some examples with AI. In terms of, what you could ask it to do with rubrics, those prompts that I just used, I had it draft a rubric for a course assignment, right? Where depending on the prompt, you can put as many details in as ranging from all the assignment directions and learning objectives to just kind of listing the criteria you want and the 4-point scale. And if you don't like what it gives you the first time, you can regenerate it a few times. You can ask it to modify the draft it's given you. Maybe you asked for holistic originally and you wanted analytic, or you asked for holistic and it gave you analytic, like we just saw. Or maybe you thought you wanted holistic, but then it seemed too subjective, so you wanted to create an analytic one. Sometimes it'll just put out a rubric with a list of descriptions. You may need to, as I did in one of the prompts, specify that you want it in a table format. So it's easier to, kind of see, organize, and export and make edits. And you can also make changes to, maybe it gives you evaluation criteria. You didn't ask for any specific. So for example, with the holistic rubric that ChatGPT gave me analytical, say I actually wanted analytical. And these are the criteria it gave me. Maybe I'm like, can you also add, proper formatting according to, I guess, college writing would be MLA, right? Format. So I could ask it to add a criteria, remove a criteria, replace a criteria. And then, as I mentioned before, platforms like Microsoft Copilot. There's also Google Gemini, but just so you're aware, Stony Brook has disabled Google Gemini for our school-based Google accounts because we are endorsing and going with Copilot. But if you did have a personal Gmail and you wanted to play around with Google Gemini, they will also export their rubrics to Google Sheets, so you can make edits. And so your expertise is necessary both for the creation of the prompts as well as for, kind of refining those descriptions to be more of what you're looking for. So some sample prompts. And I actually may edit these slides later just to kind of highlight the portions that would be interchangeable. So they end up being kind of fragments where you can include your own information. So, for example, this would be something that you would change, right? Like what class is being taught. You would change the type of rubric. You would change what the assignment is. You would change what you want the scale to be and what you would want your criteria to be, right? So that would be all of your own decisions um, to decide what fits your class. And so here you see one that's a little less detailed. It specifies the assignment and that it's a team project with a written report and presentation. Again, you could add to this prompt, assignment details are included in the uploaded file. So Copilot does allow you to upload the file. And again, as long as you're using your Stony Brook account, it is a protected platform that won't share your information beyond our own server. Um, again, this is a little bit more simplistic. So if you put a more simplistic and less detailed prompt in to start with, you will end up needing to make more adjustments on the back end, whether that's through more prompting of the AI or exporting it and making the changes yourself. But here, actually, there's a little bit more detail on what the assignment is. And I did not mean to have those come in through animation, so I apologize. And then, here's the writing course one that I just asked. So again, you can take a few different approaches here. How much detail you put in will, help determine the quality of what comes out and how much tweaking it needs. But it can give you that foundation to get started. I already did the live demo. So when you have more than one instructor or more than one grader, if you have TAs, it's really important to discuss your interpretations of those rubric descriptions with others to make sure you're applying those in the same way. It can also be helpful to grade or evaluate a few student work samples together to make sure you're applying it similarly. It could be retroactive student work that you still have samples of, or, it could be the actual assignments, do the first few together and then, divide and conquer the rest. If there are a large number of readers, a formal norming or calibration process is often recommended, and we'll talk a little bit about what that looks like. But ultimately, the goal here is to establish that the rubric is reliable and valid, right? It's a measure of what we're looking to assess, and ultimately to be consistent and fair to all students. So what is a norming session, right? That's where you bring together all of the faculty or all of the raters, typically for 1 or 2 hours. You would have one person facilitating. And so the ideal facilitator is knowledgeable about the rubric. They may have been the person to create it. They should be familiar with some samples of students' work on the assignment the rubric was created for. And ideally have some experience with assessment. And norming, right, is a good idea, whether it's for, grading at the course level or for program level assessment. But ultimately, the goal of a session is to bring everyone together to rate some student samples and have discussion to the point where you reach consensus on how to score students. So, if the total score on a rubric is out of 6 points or more, right, whether by adding the criteria together or if it's a holistic rubric, if raters are within 1 point of one another, if it's 6 points, if it's more points, it could be a little bit more, then consensus would have been reached. So a norming session typically would involve preparing some student work samples prior to the session. At the start, there would be an overview of why you are norming, right? That importance of, fairness and consistent, reliable interpretation and application of the rubric. Um, an introduction of the actual assignment or task. What are students composing, writing, presenting that is being reviewed and assessed, and go over the rubric to see if anybody has questions about any of the verbiage and the descriptions and how to interpret it. Oftentimes, the facilitator may go through one specific work sample, sometimes one that's considered like ideal, like a very strong sample of a student's work, and discuss kind of, how they were rated using the rubric. And then there would be a first round of ratings where everyone gets a work sample, scores it, and then there's recording of the results and discussion of any scores that seemed particularly out of the norm or different from the rest of the group. There would be some discussion to try and reach consensus about what the appropriate score would be for that criteria or for that work if it was holistic. And then there would be a second round of ratings where you maybe go through another 2 or 3 work samples. And then again, share and record results. And if there are still discrepant scores, you would again discuss and try to reach consensus. Again, it doesn't have to be perfect. Consensus, if it's within a point for every 6 points on the rubric, it's pretty close. You just want to really address and have conversations around anywhere that one person or more than one person are really outside of what the typical rating is. Do you ever add an AI tool to the norming session? That's a good question. I guess you could potentially upload a student sample work and a copy of the rubric to the AI and ask the AI to rate the student's work. And the AI can also be another rater among the group and see if what AI is coming up with is similar to what the group is coming up with. I think it's interesting because there's definitely potential in the future for AI to be part of grading and giving feedback in this way. I've played with it a little bit, at least with the course I taught last spring. And my initial thoughts were that it's not quite there yet in terms of giving students very good feedback. It tends to give very vague feedback. At times it tended to be, and I think I tend to be a nice grader. I like to give students the benefit of the doubt, but sometimes I thought it was a little too nice. Like it was trying to say like, oh, well, nice attempt at this. And I was just like, yeah, no, that was not good. So I wasn't happy with where AI was with feedback, but it could certainly be interesting to have AI be a rater as well, and see if AI's interpretations line up with that of the rest of the group as well. But I personally, at least as of last spring, did not think AI was extremely helpful in terms of making grading more efficient yet. Whether there's potential, because everything improves very quickly, sure. But right now, I think it's not quite there yet. Excuse me. So rubrics and Brightspace. When you want to set up your rubrics, you go to course admin, assessment, and then rubrics. So I'm actually going to quickly, oh, and I think I closed my Brightspace page, which I had not intended to, but I'm going to launch it real quick. Button timed out at some point. So I'm going to go into my sandbox course. So whenever you want to add a rubric, you go to course admin and then rubrics. And you can create a new rubric here, right? And it will let you decide whether you want to have the rubric be analytical or holistic, right? So you see when you do the holistic one, there's now just 4 levels and overall descriptions for each level. Whereas analytic, has that criteria, and you can keep adding more criteria based on how many you want, right? And then that decision about which criteria you want to include, right? So you would name each of your criteria. You would decide on performance levels, right? To default, Brightspace does to 4 performance levels. Like I said, that 3 or 4 tend to be the typical best practice. And then you can have a description for each level, right? This is where you could put like exemplary, satisfactory, developing, and novice, or something of that nature, right? And you can decide again on overall points. Now, if you don't want to weight one criteria any more from the other, by default, it will make them all equal. So you see each criteria is out of 4 points here. Sometimes you do want to build a little subjectivity in your rubric. So you might want something like 2, 4, 6, 8. Right. And then some people would get 1 or 2 here, right, to have that leeway. If you think they're closer to developing than some others, you could do that. So you have that ability scoring wise. You can also do custom points, and that allows you to weigh certain things more, right? So perhaps that 3 and 4. This is like your content section. That's what's most important to you. But then you also want to consider grammar and spelling and MLA format, but those 2 are not as important to you. So you make those worth 4 points, whereas the content is worth 8, right? And that's really how you would do weighing for extra criteria. And then you would, as I mentioned before, put in descriptions for each performance level. And you would have your rubric and Brightspace. When you want to link a rubric to an assignment, you would create the assignment, or if you already have it created, you'd go to Edit Assignment. And then rubrics are under Evaluation and Feedback, and that's where you can add the rubric you created, which you would have given a name, so you can find the one you want. You can see in my sandbox, I've created a lot that I never saved or named, so I have a lot called Untitled. But that is how you would link your rubric to an assignment in Brightspace. I see a question, can you upload the Excel or already created rubric into Brightspace? I do not believe there is a way to do that as of yet. That is a nice feature that I think is kind of on their wish list of things that they may work towards creating in the future, but right now it is kind of just needing to go through, select the levels, and copy and paste your descriptions. So there is on here, I linked, and I mentioned I will share the slides in addition to this quick demo. I linked step-by-step instructions for creating a rubric in Brightspace. So just some other upcoming sessions with CELT that may relate somewhat to the topics we touched on today. We have a number of different sessions, so I do recommend you go to our website and look at all of them. But if you wanted to better organize Brightspace, particularly for use in asynchronous courses, we have a workshop upcoming on October 18th about ensuring organized navigation using document templates. And then for AI, we talked about how you can use AI to make rubrics, but we have an AI bootcamp coming up on November 14th, and we'll talk about how you can use AI for things like writing learning objectives, creating lesson plans, planning class activities, creating multiple choice and exam questions, things of that nature. So if you like the idea of potentially leveraging AI to make your work a little bit more efficient, that workshop on November 14th is a great one to attend as well. So that brings us to the conclusion of today's workshop. There is a QR code on the screen for you to complete a brief survey on your workshop experience. And I know it's 1:58 and I want to be respectful of time, but if anybody has questions, feel free to either unmute and ask or just stick them in the chat. I know there were some questions as we went along, which I think I tried to answer as we went through, but if I missed any. Hi.
Hey, I think you answered my question already. I was just asking if we're going to have access to this PowerPoint so we can kind of revisit.
Yes, I'm going to share a PDF of the slides and then also the recording of today's session as well.
Awesome. Thank you.
You're welcome. Happy to. Any other questions? Okay. Inclusive webinar. Yes, I believe we do have an inclusive teaching webinar at 3 p.m. today. So that's still ongoing. Like I said, we have a lot of, if I put all of our events, I would have 6 slides at the end with everything we do. But yeah, we have our inclusive teaching workshop today as well.
Thank you, Amie.
You're welcome. Thank you all for attending, and I appreciate your patience with my voice being a little raspy. If I had this presentation last Wednesday, I don't think I would have been able to present at all. So thank you for your patience. And I did mention before, I do individual consultations. So if you want help kind of getting started or just reviewing a rubric for a specific assignment or a specific course, feel free to reach out to me, and I'll just throw my email in the chat. You probably have it from the registration and promotions as well, but it's just Amie.Cohen@Stony Brook. So I'm happy to assist in any way. All right. Thank you, everyone. I'm going to stop the recording. Have a